Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. This program deals with the flood of 1935 that devastated the southern part of the Finger Lakes region and caused damage throughout the Finger Lakes. It has almost faded from living memory. After all, not many people who experienced that flood in 1935 are still alive today. Although it almost has faded from living memory, the July 1935 flood was just as big a disaster for this portion of the Finger Lakes as was the June 1972 flood that many of us remember vividly. The July 1935 flood killed 44 people in southern New York and northern Pennsylvania and did millions of dollars in damages. There is a common saying, especially in the Midwest and South, and especially among senior citizens, that as you are saying your goodbyes at a gathering, you say, "Be seeing you soon, if the good Lord's willin', and the creek don't rise." That saying is very appropriate to introduce the details of the flood of 1935. The July 8th and 9th, 1935 flood originated in a large thunderstorm complex known scientifically as a mesoscale convective system. A typical thunderstorm in the summer is a few minutes of heavy rain, followed by lighter rain as the storm moves on. And eventually it tapers off and things dry out. In a thunderstorm complex, however, they may undergo one storm after another, passing over the same spot like cars of a freight train. All of those downpours can add up very quickly. The quote in this frame emphasizes that the flood came without warning to people who were preoccupied with summer vacation plans and escape from the oppressive heat. I am not a meteorologist, but I can tell you that some of the details as to how these several serious rainstorms came to happen in the Finger Lakes region, especially the southern tier portion. On the evening of Wednesday, July 3rd, a well-defined disturbance was moving eastward over the Hudson Bay region. That disturbance is shown in the red arrow on the map. That same evening, a mass of polar air had begun to move southward over northern Canada. This is shown in the blue arrows. That same evening, a disturbance was forming over the Rocky Mountains and the Plain States. This is shown with the black arrow. On Thursday, July 4th, the northern disturbance had moved to the lower St. Lawrence Valley. The Rocky Mountain disturbance had developed more fully and was centered over South Dakota, and the polar continental air had overspread the entire Hudson Bay region. By the morning of Friday, July 5th, the northern disturbance was centered over the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The Dakota disturbance was over Minnesota and extreme western Ontario province of Canada and moving northeastward. That disturbance couldn't proceed eastward because a wedge of the polar air mass had moved enough southward. Then the general drift of the upper air currents carried this initial Rocky Mountain disturbance toward the southeast. Until the morning of Sunday, July 7th, it was centered near Buffalo, New York. Meanwhile, the polar air masses shown with the blue arrows have by the evening of Friday, July 5th, reached New England and the extreme parts of northern New York State. By 8 p.m. on Sunday, July 7th, this cold front extended from Lake Ontario to near New Haven, Connecticut. Excessive rains were falling. The cold front drifted slowly southward and merged with another disturbance that had moved from Georgia to the New Jersey coast by the evening of July 8th. So we have the very unusual situation in which a mass of warm and very moist tropical maritime air moved north-northwestward over eastern and central New York, while at the same time a mass of polar continental air was moving southeastward over the Great Lakes region, and its front had reached the eastern Lake Erie by the evening of Saturday, July 7th. The inevitable result was that for a period of many hours, there was heavy and prolonged rainfall occurring over a considerable area, of which Cortland appeared to be the center. And the rains came and came. It was just after people had celebrated the 4th of July. Starting on Friday, July 5th, 3 days of rather heavy rain came. Note in the text the number of rainstorms happening on these days. It is rather unusual for a given place to have more than one thunderstorm in a given day. The number of storms shown are for the city of Ithaca. From these several days of heavy rain, the earth and the stream banks just couldn't hold any more water. While most folks were sound asleep on the early morning of Monday, July 8th, devastating flooding did much damage throughout the Finger Lakes, but especially in the southern tier as well as northern Pennsylvania. It is important to remember that this was happening to people at a time when people outside of the cities and villages scarcely had electricity, and for many, not even a telephone. So for many people, there was no warning at all. And add to that reality that the flooding was serious early in the morning of July 8th, when people were asleep, and you have a recipe for real disaster. So what really happened? As you will soon see in pictures, the Canisteo River and its tributaries putting much of Hornell under water. All of downtown Bath flooded. The Finger Lakes rose considerably, with the Hammondsport village inundated. Ithaca was flooded. Torrents of water poured into Watkins Glen State Park and the village. Farm livestock were washed away because of the rapidly flowing waters, even in pastures. Cottages along the Finger Lakes were swept into the lakes. Bridges, railroads, and roads were washed out. The situation was even worse in Corning, Elmira, and Binghamton. Several communities in the southern Finger Lakes region recorded record amounts of rainfall for a 24-hour period of time, as well as for 48 hours and 72-hour time periods. The top 5 communities in this frame have data compiled at weather stations, so they are reliable figures. The bottom 2 communities' figures are not from official weather station data, so they are not as reliable. Nevertheless, you can see in this data that quite large amounts of rainfall came on Friday, July 5th through Sunday, July 7th. Before moving on, I want to add here that Cornell University meteorologist Douglas Payne at the time said, quote, "Just a 2-hour rainfall of 2¼ inches would have caused the flooding," unquote. In the greater Ithaca area, probably the worst off was the village of Dryden, which had 4 feet of floodwaters. Here you see the front page of the New York Times for Tuesday, July 9th, 1935. You will note that the story for this upstate New York flooding is the lead story, found typically on the right-hand side of the front page. At the top, you see an Elmira newspaper headline for its Monday, July 8th issue. Note how this headline reports that storms ravaged the Finger Lakes region and didn't use the wording southern tier. At the bottom, you see a quote from an Albany newspaper at the end of the year 1935, reporting that it considered the July flood was not only the greatest news event of the year, it was also one of the biggest stories in Empire State history to that point. Here is a close-up of some of the New York Times front page story. Note the headline says 37 dead, but that figure was later revised upward to over 40. Also, the headline says damage is put at 10 million, but that figure was later revised upward to 40 million. Remember, that's $1935. Note how the second paragraph of the article at right says that several thousand persons were driven from their homes in inundated lowlands as swollen creeks, rivers, and lakes spilled their overflow into the streets of cities, villages, and so on. This portion of the article of the New York Times described briefly the specific condition in various communities. Note at the right for Trumansburg, it says that more than a dozen buildings in the business section crashed with the swollen stream flowing through the center of the village, and the debris was swept into Cayuga Lake. Trumansburg had a population of 1,700, and they were evacuated. Here is a reporting on the situation in 3 more communities. Back on the front page of the New York Times was this listing of those who died from the flooding. I have picked out certain of those who died because of the flood, and that information is at the lower right. Note that some who died were very young. Note also that in Ithaca, a man died of a heart attack brought on probably by the shock of the whole flood situation. Note also that 3 perished in a cottage north of Hector on Seneca Lake, and 2 of those deaths were youth. How sad. This map was part of the New York Times article as it continued on page 3. Note that the flooding was not limited to the Finger Lakes region as we commonly know it. Now let's start looking at some visuals by beginning with Watkins Glen State Park. On July 7, 1935, Watkins Glen, like the entire southern Finger Lakes region, suffered the beginnings of the so-called flood of the century. 11 inches of rain fell in 48 hours time period. It was estimated by observers that creek waters in the Glen rose to just 5 feet below the suspension bridge. That's an upward surge of 80 feet of water. Raging water full of debris swept through the Glen, ravaging trail structures and forever changing the contour of the gorge. The picture at right shows how the raging waters swept away walkway railings. The picture at bottom left shows how uprooted tree trunks piled up against the stone arch of the park entrance. Here you see what happened to the New York Central Railroad Bridge over the upper portion of the Glen of Watkins Glen State Park. Note in the bottom right picture that a section of the bridge actually landed in the stream itself. This is an aerial view of the same railroad bridge destruction. This is another visual of the damage done to the railroad track over the Glen. Here you see the uprooted trees that were piled high behind the entrance gateway. The 1935 flood caused terrible damage at Watkins Glen. As you can see at the picture taken right after the torrent had passed, the parking lot has been ripped out and the stairs up to the tunnel were gone, leaving the tunnel suspended on the cliff. Upper left, you see the stairway the way it did look. These photos are courtesy of the Montour Falls Public Library. The flood utterly transformed the landscape. A picturesque fountain and flower bed once stood on the site, but were destroyed by the flood waters. Floodwaters charged out of the Glen Park and swept through the village of Watkins Glen. This is a picture of a car parked in a driveway of a home in the village. Note how the runoff floodwaters have dropped a lot of rubble around the car. This is more about the rubble deposited by the floodwaters in the village of Watkins Glen. Returning to the Glen Park itself, the July 1935 flood of the century left the park devastated. There was much cleanup and rebuilding that had to be done before the park could even be reopened to visitors. Interestingly, much of that work was done by a crew of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which coincidentally had arrived at the park just 2 days before the Great Flood. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, was a public relief program for young men that was part of FDR's New Deal. Watkins Glen Park was closed for the rest of 1935 as CCC crew labored to do cleanup and repair the extensive damage. In the picture at left, you see some of the flood damage. In the picture at right, you see CCC stonework that was then installed. This naturalistic stonework remains today as the perfect complement to the natural gorge scenery. These Elmira Star-Gazette newspaper visuals show the CCC workers who were clearing up the flood destruction. It is important to remember that this flood happened during the Great Depression, and the CCC was a New Deal program for young men to have jobs so that they could send money back to their homes and their parents. Shifting to Interlaken, here you see the floodwaters in the Interlaken area having washed out the dirt from underneath a section of the Lehigh Valley Railroad line. Inside the village of Interlaken itself, several stores suffered flooding, leaving a lot of mud and so on to be cleaned up. Outside the village of Interlaken, many bridges were carried away or badly damaged. Several sections of railroad track were washed out. Now to begin to deal with the damages at Lodi Point on Seneca Lake. The map at left shows the location of Lodi Point on Seneca Lake. The map at right shows a close-up of that Lodi Point area today. You will note there is an old lake road that proceeds south from Lodi Point. That area today has a large number of cottages, but there were only a few there in 1935. Also note on the map at right the Mill Stream location and the many other streams that empty into Seneca Lake. These are the streams that will cause the flooding in the Lodi Point area. For those of you who remember well the flooding from Hurricane Agnes in late June 1972, or if you are from the immediate Lodi Hector area that had serious flooding in August 2018, you might well think this quote pertains to one of those more recent floods. But it actually is part of the official investigative report for the July 1935 flood in the Lodi Point area. This Lodi area was just about the north edge of the most serious flooding of July 1935. Here is a picture of a cottage that was extensively surrounded by flood waters. Between 25 and 30 camps at Lodi Point were either washed into Seneca Lake or they were washed off their foundations. One of the camps was floating in the center of Seneca Lake, half a mile from its foundation. Similarly, between 15 and 20 camps suffered a similar fate at Valois, which is just a short distance south of Lodi Point. Water covered Lodi Point to a depth of 4 feet. Highways leading to Lodi Point and Valois were impassable. Telephone wires and electric wires were so damaged that these services were not usable for a few days. This is one of the 25 to 30 cottages washed off their foundations. It was not unusual for at least 3 feet of water to wash through cottages in the immediate Lodi Point area. Scores of people were forced to leave their camps in boats. After all, it was the end of a holiday weekend, with some people having to climb on the roofs of largely floating cottages until assistance came to rescue them. Water covered Lodi Point. Here is a picture of another cottage that didn't get washed into the lake simply because of trees that kept that from happening. Farmland in the area was heavily washed away, with crops ruined, topsoil gone. Nearly every road lost bridges, besides being badly torn up, with shoulders to the roads gone and cave-ins here and there in the roads themselves. Electric service was off from Sunday, July 7th until nearly midnight on Tuesday, July 9th. This meant that there was no way of doing the initial reporting or getting follow-ups about electric service. In the village of Lodi, just a short few miles away, many buildings had cellars full of water. The roofs had leaks. Fortunately, no lives were lost in the Lodi Point area or in the village of Lodi. This is a nice, serene picture of the YMCA camp at Lodi Point before the July 1935 flood. This YMCA camp was scheduled to open for the summer season on Tuesday, July 9th, but it was under 4 feet of water. 15 older boys from Geneva went to this camp the night of Friday, July 5th, and they were forced to leave by the rising waters, and they made their way to other homes and then returned to their Ontario County homes. Many camping tents, 10 platforms, boats, and other camping equipment were washed away by the torrential floods of that weekend. My good friend Naomi Brewer is a great local historian who remembers well the flood of 1935 as it impacted the Wyers Point area just north of Sheldrake on Cayuga Lake. Naomi Brewer was 10 years old at the time of the flood. At my request late in August 2020, this is what she wrote about her memories of the flood of 1935. The 1935 flood did much damage on my family's property. At Wyers Point, the bridge over Wyers Big Creek was washed away. The creek came down from Route 89 and beyond. It also had a creek that came down by Sheldrake Springs and also along the back line of our property from the Highland Farm. My grandfather had a small dam where he gathered water used to water the workhorses. That dam and many trees, bushes, and debris came full force down to join the bigger creek and head for Cayuga Lake. All of that end of the property was wooded, but at the bottom of the hill to the south of the flat land from the creek was good soil. My grandfather had for years a wonderful garden, asparagus bed, pear and other fruit trees, currant and gooseberry bushes, also ginseng. At the time of the flood, I was 10 years old, and I remember many walks from our house to the south along the lake road down to the flat to gather whatever was ripe. The flood not only washed out the bridge over the road, but the flat land, and everything was gone on it. The road was closed for some time. A construction company from Seneca Falls came and built a new bridge. We often walked down to see the new bridge being built. For that period, my father worked for the town of Ovid, and the trucks, machines, and men did a lot of road work of repair in that area. The lake level went way up, and floating trees and so on washed into docks, and damage was had all around the lake. Great deal of damage happened all down Sheldrake Creek and flooded Sheldrake Point and buildings. Alice Ferris of Sheldrake was in Ithaca with her boyfriend from Interlaken. They were in his car returning home when the flood waters washed them away. They hung on to the car roof, but Alice couldn't hang on any longer and was swept away and drowned. Alice was the daughter of Edgar and Jessie Ferris and lived on the hill overlooking Sheldrake Creek, across from Barry's Mill on Morgan Road. Naomi Brewer also added that the water gushing down the Sheldrake Creek destroyed a mill and washed a lot of debris out into the lake. It also deposited a lot of mud in the basement of the Sheldrake house, whose kitchen was located in that basement. Here we have the account of a car with 8 Rochester youths, the car that was washed 200 feet down a flooded creek between Ovid Center and Sheldrake. The flooding was worst in the more southern tier portions of the Finger Lakes region. Here we begin to see conditions in Bath and Steuben County. Railroads in 1935 were a very important means of transportation. Here you see tracks of the Lackawanna Railroad near Bath, suffering much damage from the flooding. The creek that flows through the heart of Hornell carried waters from a watershed of 210 square miles. Through the city, the channel of this creek is 40 feet wide and less than 25 feet deep. In the 1935 flood, however, water raced 15 feet deep over the floor of the Seneca Street Bridge. Here is another scene of flooding in Hornell. If you look carefully at the center of this picture, you will see a telephone pole that was driven through the wall of this building in Hornell. It is important to remember that flooding does destroy people's homes, but it also causes serious damages to industries and businesses. Here is one of the many bridges destroyed by the flooding. Highways were also destroyed or badly damaged. Here you see damages from the flood to the Erie Railroad buildings in Hornell. Shifting to Hammondsport, there was serious flooding in Hammondsport, which is located at the south end of Keuka Lake. This shows the flooding in the park in the center of the village of Hammondsport. The Corning Leader newspaper reported that the flood gouged out Orchard Street 6 feet deep and scattered brandy casks from nearby wine company warehouses. Scattered those brandy casks all along the village. In summer months, 1 inch of rainfall in the Keuka Lake watershed typically will raise the level of Keuka Lake by 6 inches. In the July 1935 storm, Penn recorded over 5 inches of rain. Hammondsport received 8 inches. So that should mean that the lake level of Keuka Lake rose about 3 feet. In late spring, the normal level of Keuka Lake is at its highest, at 714.5 feet above sea level. As a result of the early July 1935 rainfall, the level of Keuka Lake reached at least 717 feet above sea level, about 2.5 feet higher than the normal spring highest level. It is important to remember that the Keuka Lake overflow waters empty into Seneca Lake, and that the Seneca Lake overflow waters empty into the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, which empties into Cayuga Lake. This means that the lock and floodgates in Waterloo need to hold back floodwaters to prevent flooding in Waterloo and Seneca Falls. Here you see flooding in the Corning Painted Post area. Note that people are in a rowboat where there was a road. This is the first of 2 other views of flooding in the Painted Post area. This is the second view. There was major damage to the Corning Glassworks factory. The flooding in Montour Falls caused much damage to homes. Here you see some flood damage in Montour Falls. Shifting to Ithaca in Tompkins County, here you see flooding in the streets of Ithaca. This shows damages to the cement works factory in Ithaca. Many cottages on Cayuga Lake near Ithaca were greatly damaged. Once again, like other places throughout the southern Finger Lakes, bridges in Ithaca were but toys in the hands of the floodwaters. The Trumansburg or Frontenac Creek flows down through the center of the village of Trumansburg, so there was much damage to the lower parts of the village. Complicating the actual flooding situation was that the Trumansburg Creek became plugged with trees and other debris carried by the waters. This plugging of the creek caused a change in the creek's course. Here you see some of the evidence. 2 people were drowned in the 4 a.m. floodwaters that were 8 feet deep that came through the center part of the business district. Also in Trumansburg, the floodwaters wiped out 2 dams that helped create ponds of water that were used by village residents. One fortunate result of this, however, was that the village created a new water supply system. This is a close-up view of the building shown in the previous slide. Note the extensive damage to this building, located right along the stream. As the floodwaters receded, the wreckage could be seen much more clearly. Taconic Boulevard was the road between Ithaca to Taconic Falls State Park. Do you see the bridge in the upper picture? The bridge was washed out. Here you see more damage done to Taconic Boulevard between Ithaca and Taconic Falls State Park. The waters gushing down Taconic Creek did a lot of damage to the road below the lower falls of the park. Shifting east of Ithaca to the village or hamlet of Lisle, here you see one house that suffered flood damage. Another house, you see the damage. It looks like the flooded stream left lots of debris near the house, as well as washing out the front porch. In Marathon, in 1938, Edgar Adams, who had worked for the Marathon Independent newspaper for then a total of 67 years, stated that the 1935 flood in Marathon was, quote, a humdinger. Here you see an area where you really wouldn't expect to have serious flood damage, but the damage was done to the road because of the rapid runoff waters. This graph shows how streams in the Binghamton area greatly swelled in their runoff water volume starting July 8th. Flooding was particularly bad in the immediate area where the Shenango River emptied into the Susquehanna River. As the caption suggests, the flooding in Binghamton made it look like houseboats in water. Rising stream waters were higher than the road portions of bridges that didn't get washed out. Some houses were washed into the river as the riverbank was washed away so much. Now to shift back to northern Cayuga Lake. While the flood damage was most severe in the southern part of the Finger Lakes, there was serious damage in the more northern parts of the Finger Lakes as well. Let me show this with a few specific comments about the northern portion of Cayuga Lake. First, in the Montezuma Muckland Acres, just east of Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, there was extensive flooding. As mentioned in this frame, these important farmlands were a scene of sore desolation. A few heads of early ripening cabbage were cut off their plants by boys who waded along the rows of cabbage plants in their swimsuits. The floodings caused serious hardship to many families who depended upon these muckland crops for their livelihood. It is important to remember all of this was happening during some of the Great Depression years. Second, from Bridgeport to Lewis Point, every dock or pier was washed away except the big pier in front of Cayuga Lake Park Pavilion. At the park, the large dock was weighted down with barrels of water and heavy stones in an effort to keep it from being destroyed or washed away. Immediately north of Cayuga Lake Park was the Morehouse boat livery. There was water 4 feet deep inside the boathouse building. The Leroy Sullivan boat livery at Lewis Point reported 4 rowboats, 2 canoes being swept away by the flood waters. Many people in the immediate area reported the loss of their boats, some of which were later found in coves and inlets as far north as the railroad bridge across Cayuga Lake and the Montezuma marshes. In November 1941, that's over 6 years after the flooding, the New York State Court of Claims dismissed claims for $330,000 worth of damages brought by owners of 47 farms as a result of damage to land and crops in the unprecedented Montezuma Marshes floods of July 1935 in Cayuga, Seneca, and Wayne counties. The state of New York had been sued for negligence for these damages, ranging from one claim of $532 to as high a claim as $21,145. These claims resulted from they alleged from the overflow of waters from the Barge Canal and Cayuga and Seneca lakes, but the court judge ruled there was no negligence on the part of the state. However, the silt load carried by floodwaters can change habitat for animals by burying that habitat. Prior to the 1935 flood, diving ducks used to spend their winters at the south end of Cayuga Lake, feeding on the weed beds. The silt deposited on those weed beds buried the weed beds, and since that time, the rafts of scaup, redhead, and canvasback ducks have also vanished, according to a 1972 article in the Penn Chronicle Express newspaper. Shifting back to Seneca Lake and the hamlet of Willard, where the Willard State Hospital was located, the hospital's boathouse was completely surrounded by water. You can barely see the dock to the left of the boathouse. Within the hospital grounds, there was extensive erosion. Here you see exposed the tunnel that carried steam as well as telephone and electric cables. The tunnel has suffered much damage from the erosion. The erosion also disrupted the operation of the railroad line within the hospital grounds. As Seneca County historian, I want to point out some detailed information about the extent of damages suffered in Seneca County. The immediate estimate was simply stated as millions of dollars. 4 lives were lost. 25 bridges had to be replaced, including the main bridge in Waterloo over the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, which had carried the floodwaters from the Seneca Lake towards Cayuga Lake. Here you see the facts and figures of the Red Cross Disaster Relief Commission for the entire area of the Southern Finger Lakes in northern Pennsylvania. A total of 43 people were killed. 142 homes were destroyed. Over 9,000 were partially destroyed. Not to be overlooked was the extensive damage to farmlands. Also, there was the need to take immediate action to prevent serious health crises from developing. Here you see some Hornell area residents standing in a long line to get inoculations against typhoid fever. Both the state and federal governments realized that some major actions were needed to prevent another flood from causing the damages that the July 1933 floods had caused. Reports like the one shown here prompted state and federal funds to build higher concrete walls along the banks of streets flowing through cities like Hornell. Nevertheless, there was major flooding again in the southern portions of the Finger Lakes region as a result of rainfalls from the remnants of Hurricane August in late June 1972. When you get that much rainfall in a 24-hour time period, it is difficult to prevent flooding from runoff waters. Here you see rainfall amounts in certain places in the Finger Lakes in that 1972 flooding. You also see the serious damage done as a result of flooding in Elmira and Corning. Both Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lakes rose 3 feet in their water level overnight from the runoff from that rainfall. Also, there was localized flooding in the Lodi Point Hector area mid-August 2018, causing much damage. Nevertheless, I would like to say that we are more equipped today to deal with serious flooding as a result of what happened in the 1935 floods. I hope you have enjoyed this program, which is another piece in our Finger Lakes history.